Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, in this video, I'd like to talk about Koury Ritchins and James Craig. Okay, these are two people who are in Mormon families. Okay, Koury Ritchins is not born into Mormonism, but she's part of a Mormon family. And James Craig is the dentist from Colorado who I believe was from Utah and is actually a Utah Mormon, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, at least I know he's a Mormon. A true Mormon in a Mormon family. And Koury Ritchins, I think she married into Mormonism, but she was already living in Utah. And so she was already kind of part of the Mormon culture in Utah. And basically, we have these suburban families where one spouse, under whatever condition, starts to get this idea of poisoning the other, poisoning the other spouse. And so I want to kind of look at these cases together. There are some important differences. I think James Craig was clearly his disturbance, let's say, that really kind of got him departed from reality. I think he was really in a very excited sort of relationship with another woman. So there was I think a lot of pleasure, I think, in his disturbance, but it was a disturbance, probably very similar to Chad Daybell and Chris Watts. I mean, this theme really does seem to repeat. That overexcitement of being in a sort of a side relationship, cheating on your spouse or whatever. It's sort of like a forbidden pleasure or whatever, and just all that excitement that can really, in the end, it creates a disturbance. And it's not a coincidence that when you get into that disturbed state, that overexcited, frenzied state, that suddenly, surprise, you don't have the best judgment and your behavior changes. So we shouldn't be surprised by that. And even in our personal lives, those of us who have any kind of behavior issue, those of us who have any struggles around anger management or just discipline or whatever, all of us know. And if you want to test the waters, you can test the waters, but I think we know how it goes. When we get involved in things that are very exciting, very stimulating, it depends on how you manage it, but there can be some impairment in judgment. That's just it's the way it is. I mean, even something as simple as having a shopping addiction. You just end up spending a little too much money than you should. And we all kind of know that how excitement and how enthusiasm can kind of a little bit play with our judgment. Obviously, in cases like this, we see the extreme. Okay, so with Craig, I think it's James Craig. With James Craig, it is the excitement of being in a forbidden, adulterous relationship. Okay, with Koury Ritchins, I don't know that there's come out any evidence that she was actually with another man. That may be true. Okay, but even if she were having some infidelity, okay, with another man, I think the main excitement and I think the main stimulator and the main disturbance for Koury is her excitement over making money. Okay. And apparently she wasn't even that good at making money. I think she liked to take a lot of risks and just kind of get over her head, kind of get out of her depth, I think, in business. And my understanding is that she was in a lot of debt and she was paying off a lot of debt. So she's kind of like wanting to get herself into this major real estate project as a way of sort of maybe paying off major debts that she's already got. That's kind of the way I understood it. If I'm wrong about that, I just know that there was a lot of debt in her business life combined with overreaching. Okay. And I think her husband, who actually came from money and who actually had successful businesses, I think it was easy for him to see that she was sort of out of her depth and maybe getting a little too overeager and overexcited. But for some people, getting in the world of making business deals and buying and selling real estate, that can be so exciting for some people because it's just such for some people, money is like a really powerful stimulant. And I think in the case of Koury Ritchins, maybe she had kind of narcissistic fantasies around, success and making money. It was probably just so exciting for her. And that was just one of her enthusiastic issues, that just got such a frenzy going that it was almost the equivalent of a man maybe having an adulterous affair with a woman. Maybe, if you try to understand that, like I don't get off on money that much, so I don't really understand that. But I think for some people, being very successful in business deals and making money can just be a major stimulant. And it just sort of, it just kind of gets that frenzy state going to where now we can talk about, the sequence of maybe having a little bit diminished capacity. Now, I'm not talking about the legal definition of diminished capacity. And I know that there nowhere in the United States will they accept a defense or a defensive strategy of, of diminished capacity based on personality disorder. It's very rare. I think in Europe, you might see that more than in the United States. But in common sense terms, we're talking about some reduction in sobriety. Okay. Because I tried to say this in the context of Lori Vallow, but when we're talking about anybody, whether it's a criminal or whether it's just an everyday person, most of us have, without realizing it, most of us have like a buffer zone, just even the smallest buffer zone, even just slightly, just the slightest buffer zone, where we have sort of like an area of undisturbed reflection, okay, where we can sort of monitor our behavior, and it's just in real time enough that it's just influential enough that we can just put a little dampening and just a little bit of, kind of a buffer in how we actually deliberate into behavior. Okay. And so in the case of Koury Ritchins, I think she was already kind of ADHD to begin with. When I've seen any interview with her, like the interview when she went on a daily news program, and she talked about her children's book or whatever, I could see the agitation. I could see there was like not very much pause between when they asked her questions and then she would respond. Her quickness of response indicated to me a kind of an agitated state, like an overactive, over alert, hyper aroused. You might say hyper vigilant, but hyper aroused state. Which to me, you would see in a person with ADHD or a person who's just overly stimulated and kind of in a disturbed, not at peace. You know what I mean? And obviously, when we look back and we see the Lori Vallow, the tapes of her on either in her beauty pageant in Texas, or when she went on Wheel of Fortune, we can see that Lori Vallow also was a little bit agitated. She wasn't really at peace. She was, you could tell that if you really think about it, just the rapidness of the way she answered questions and even talked over when she was answering questions. It kind of shows that elevated arousal, okay, that I think is something some people have to be concerned about, because that gets into that peaceful buffer area where normally we want to have a little bit of undisturbed mental space as a buffer, so that we can have that meaningful reflection and deliberation as we go through the course of our lives, And so when I saw the Koury Ritchins interview on that daytime television show, I could see the agitation. Okay, even though she would mask it with pleasantness, or she would try to mask it with pleasantness, underneath energetically, it's interbulation, as they would say in Scientology. I like that word, interbulation, but it's sort of like it's agitation. It's agitation, and it's not undisturbed. It's disturbed. Okay, and so when I see people like that, to me, that's almost on the ADHD spectrum. It's kind of sped up. Also, when people do just a little bit of cocaine, or they're just kind of amped up a little bit, you can sort of see it. I think a psychologist might call it on the hypomanic spectrum, but I don't know that psychology has tried to join the phenomenon of hypomania with what you see in personality disorders or ADHD. I think it's probably worth seeing if there's some similarity, because it's definitely a kind of a speeding up. Okay. And obviously, those of us who even have just the smallest amount, a lot of us don't have a lot, but if you just have a little bit of undisturbed space, undisturbed mental space, where no matter what you're dealing with in life, you have just a little bit of undisturbed area where you can just have a little bit of reflection. Okay, that can serve to just kind of it can just put just the amount of dampening in our behavior that it can just keep us from doing a few stupid things in life. Maybe it doesn't matter most of the time, but just in a few key moments, it can save you. Because you just have that extra millisecond or that extra half second of reflection, and that can cause people to really change their ideas, or change their behavior. But obviously, both with James Craig and with Koury Ritchins, both of these people were involved in very exciting kind of problematic activities, where they were just very, how would you say, overstimulated, overexcited, maybe overvigilant, combined with the tension of what the impact it was having in their marriages, so that, these cases do have at least enough in common to talk about. Okay, even though I don't believe that Koury Ritchins necessarily was. If she was involved in an infidelity, I don't think that was the driving problem for her. Okay, I think the driving problem for her was she was overexcited about her business activities, and maybe also the desperateness of wanting to pay off a lot of business debt. Okay, so she got herself into overdrive, way too sped up, and I think basically whatever reserve of possibly, like her buffer zone to have, her undisturbed reflection, I think that buffer zone basically didn't even exist. So you're talking about a person who doesn't have that thing that most of us have that can save us. It's almost like you're missing an organ. You know what I mean? And now it's not like you still have the ability to reflect even if you are disturbed. It's just that when you're undisturbed, you just have a better quality of reflection. Okay, and we need to be honest. That's a different level of capacity. Even though it's not a zero capacity. Okay, you can't say that just because you're sped up, you don't have some ability to reflect. Yeah, it's just you don't have the same quality of reflection as someone who has an undisturbed, center buffer zone, let's say, where they can just really peacefully consider things. Okay, so the more you get sped up, you pay a price, and there's a premium you pay where you lose a little bit of reflective quality. Okay, in order to really think about how you deliberate through life. So obviously, the faster you go, the more amped up, the more excited, the more stimulated, the more frenzied you get, the more you're going to see a decrease in the quality of reflection. All of us understanding that there always remains the ability to reflect. It's just that the quality of a reflection when you're in the middle of a noise storm is not the same thing as when you really have undisturbed central space. You know what I mean? In your, I guess, your core psychology. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about here is that just like with Lori Vallow, a lot of us in life, okay, we carry a lot of competitiveness. Okay, I'm assuming that this James Craig, because he was a dentist, I'm sure he was very competitive in college and in dental school. You can't be too passive and too peaceful of a person to excel in school and to be able to become a dentist. I mean, there has to be some level of drive, some level of competitiveness, and probably among dentists, maybe James Craig was maybe even a little more competitive, a little more hyped up than others. And I've seen a few interviews with James Craig or little video clips of him outside the context of his criminal action. Okay, and I can see that he is also kind of an amped up, kind of a sped up kind of guy, kind of agitated. And some people need to be careful. All of us, I think. Everybody needs to know. What's my level of speeding up? What speeds me up? And then when I get sped up, do I have to watch out for certain things that can really throw me over the edge? It's almost like a type of sobriety for a lot of us. And I think that he was already a very speedy kind of guy. And I think that, it just, if he had known better, he probably would have known that he doesn't need to get around too many pleasures, or he needs to be really careful not to get too teased up with his pleasures or excitements, because it can really come at a big price, to where you start making decisions that just aren't very wise. Think about it. Like, not very few of us are going to kill anybody, right? But a lot of us can relate to being in a workplace situation where that even if somebody's being a jerk in the workplace, even if you have somebody who's really pressing your buttons and making you upset, usually it's very wise in the workplace to really just not have any conflicts as much as possible, just to minimize, sometimes let things pass and just sort of be the invisible person who doesn't get into trouble or cause attention or cause problems for the managers or whatever. And so we all know that, even though we'd like to, control ourselves, sometimes when somebody's really irritating us and we get sort of irritated, even though we would normally believe that it's better just to sort of let things pass and choose our battles, pick our battles, whatever. Sometimes we sort of lose it. It sort of gets past our limit. And then we end up doing things that we don't really believe in necessarily, that ordinarily we wouldn't really do. Okay, so all of us know what it's like to have an impairment in our normal judgment, where we get, past our limits with some provocation, with some irritation, to where we do things that normally we wouldn't do. Like normally I wouldn't honk my horn and cause like a road rage incident, but then one day somebody does something that just pisses me off so much and so unreasonable that I find myself almost like hitting the horn of my car. Like, that's not really me, but when you get provoked enough, or when things are irritated and disturbed enough, we end up doing things that we wouldn't normally do. So all of us know what impaired judgment is, okay? And even though we want to hold criminals accountable to the full level of deliberation of any healthy, normal person, we all know privately that even though somebody who's amped up and sped up, even though they do still have the capacity to deliberate, we know from our experience that the quality of that deliberation is not the same as when they're undisturbed. Okay, we just know that. And some people, because their psychology and their neurology, they have so much ADHD, or they're so sped up naturally, they probably never really have very good judgment. And so we have to also understand that not everybody has the same quality of judgment, even in under normal circumstances. Okay, so just to be fair, those of us who have, let's say, better quality judgment, we have to be careful not to hold everybody accountable to the same standard, even though the law says so. Even though the law holds us all to the same standard, realistically, we have to have at least some. I mean, we have to at least recognize, just in the spirit of honesty and the spirit of fairness, that not everybody has the same quality of undisturbed reflection as everybody else. Okay, and it's worse when you start getting involved in really, exciting activities, really stimulating activities, things that sort of get you almost into a frenzy. Okay, and then it really goes down. Okay, and we have to respect that. Even though the law doesn't necessarily recognize that, we, in common sense, we can see that some people, when they get into enough problems in their marriage, or in disloyal activities, or maybe cheating on a spouse, or getting over your head in business, you can start to get so frenzied, get in such a frenzied state, that you don't really have a quality environment in yourself to really have the quality of judgment that the law would normally hold you accountable for. So, that's the problem. And the law is not necessarily fair, and we as a public are probably not necessarily fair, because it takes a lot of dialectical maturity to fully accept that not everybody's on the same level, okay, and yet still hold them to be accountable to what the law expects. But at the same time, we just have to understand there are different levels of capacity, and some people really do have a diminished capacity, and it's very similar to having, let's say, a diminished level of sobriety, having some level of intoxication. Just all the chemicals, all the adrenalines, all the frenzy of getting excited about things, those are drugs too. It's like drugs, and it can impair a person so they don't really have their best judgment. Okay, now, when I look at Koury Ritchins, just from seeing her in interviews and just hearing her story, okay, I get the feeling she probably chronically has kind of an oversped up something on the inside, like too sped up, too hyper alert, too hyper aroused, probably because either she has bad genetics, her genetics are maybe too sped up. I don't want to say bad genetics. I just want to say her genetics probably have her sped up a lot. And she probably just hasn't developed the maturity to find ways to sort of manage that in her life. Like, I also have sped up genetics. Like, my genetics also speed me up, but I've learned to sort of design my life, not to completely cure it. I can't cure it, but I've at least tried to design my life to where I'm not out of control with it. So it's kind of like managing yourself. I get the idea that Koury, okay. Yeah. I get the feeling that Koury probably had issues with her speed, let's say, her basic speed, where she just hadn't come to a place in life where she could really just learn to, even want to like develop like a life strategy to learn how to deal with her speed, basically. And I don't think she even came close to the point in her life where she learned that she needs to be really careful with certain activities in life that are like overstimulating. Okay, to where she could even understand how that could affect her. I don't think she was even close to that point in her life. So she's a person with zero insight who's engaging in activities that are actually unhealthy for her. They're actually unhealthy. Okay. So I just think that, it's not to say that getting into business is unhealthy per se, but when you start racking up a lot of debt and you start chronically chasing debt, I think even there's a thing called Debtors Anonymous, okay, like a 12-step program where people understand that can actually be an addictive process for a lot of people. So I think it is admissible in psychology that, there are ways of getting into, like, say, the business world and getting into business activities where you can start to get into a toxic place, okay? And I guess for some people that could be just as bad as for another person, let's say cheating on their spouse. Okay, um, so basically, I'm not going to try to excuse these people by a legal standard. I'm not into that. I think, we're all held to the legal standards. Okay. If I drink beer and I'm impaired, I'm still held to the legal standard. Okay. But just between us, just as people, we need to understand that not everybody is fully sober, regardless of whether they're actually taking drugs or whether they're actually taking alcohol or whatever. A lot of us are lacking in sobriety, and we have impaired sobriety because of the way we're living our lives and the way we're managing our own genetics. Okay. Those of us who are naturally sped up, we have a responsibility to manage those genetics because we're held to the same standard by the law. Okay. So even though the law holds us to the same standard, I think we all know in our heart of hearts, common sense, that not everybody is playing with the same deck of cards. Okay. And that's just the unfairness of life, So when I see the interview with Koury Ritchins, basically I see somebody who's very sped up, and it's probably the genetics. Okay. But then she gets into that unhealthy thing of getting into business, getting in way over her head, racking up too much chronic debt. She's chasing her debt. And she also has that narcissistic sort of fascination with making the big deal, buying the big mansion, selling it, and it's all just fantastic. And it's kind of a narcissistic issue. Okay. And I think her husband could see right through it. And probably he was trying to be nice about it. I'm sure he wasn't being a jerk about it, but here's this person who's out of control, that's not managing their own sobriety issues with debt and with business and with narcissism. Okay. And the husband tries to even just reasonably just kind of, put a check on it, or just kind of maybe not approve of everything. And she doesn't have the maturity to deal with somebody putting an interference in her, like, say, in her excitement, basically. So it's kind of like if you're sitting at the gambling table and somebody says, "Hey, it's time to go home." It's like, "Hey, give me another hour. I'm here playing a game." You don't like to be interrupted when you're in the middle of being excited. Okay. Because actually, when you're involved in addictive processes, even though they're pleasurable, at the core, you're dealing with an agitation and a disturbance. Okay. And you're actually on the inside, you're dealing with your own personal disturbance. So when someone goes and interferes and wants to put a stop, deep down inside, you register that as a very unwelcome interference. Okay. So when you have that kind of unwelcome interference, I mean, you can arouse, like, really the rage and the, really the worst parts of a person. Okay. But I think in addition to Koury being, let's say, too sped up, there's much more to Koury. Okay. Because I noticed in her interview, in that television news interview, I noticed that Koury, her gestures, her body language had kind of like dominant body language. I noticed her hands are very big, actually. And I noticed with her hand gestures, there was like a forcefulness and a sort of an aggressiveness in the her gestural language. Okay. That makes me think that Koury, and it shouldn't surprise anybody, she is a dominator. She's a dominator and she's an escalator. Okay, so that right there reminds us of Lori Vallow, who's also a dominator and an escalator. Okay, and I think in the end, Koury Ritchins was probably, it makes sense to guess that she's probably very competitive, and she probably is a destroyer. In other words, her competitiveness is so escalatory that she gets to the point where psychologically she's in the mode of destroying when she's dealing with an adversary or a challenge. Okay. So, some people have that. A lot of people have that. It's not a crime to have a destroyer in you. But if you don't know how to manage it, and if you have issues with speed, where you're also very sped up and you don't know how to manage your speed, and you don't know how to manage the fact that you have a destroyer in you, those things can sometimes combine together to present the perfect storm. Okay. And we've seen perfect storms. We saw it with Lori Vallow, and we see it again with Koury Ritchins. Just one of those aspects by itself is not going to necessarily get her into trouble. The fact that she's kind of speedy, kind of addictive, that by itself is not enough. But you combine that with the fact that she also has a destroyer in her, where she has that competitiveness to a level where there's a part of her that's capable of destroying, or at least psychologically, that's how she would approach dealing with an adversary or somebody who's challenging her. Okay, in the right combination, in the right circumstances, it can develop into, let's just say, behavior that's out of control. All right, and So how do I examine this? I mean, the law holds Koury Ritchins accountable for all of this, and I think she was aware that she was trying to poison her husband. She was fully aware of it. She was planning meticulously how to get the fentanyl. She was even saying she wanted the really strong fentanyl. I mean, she was completely conscious of what she was doing. But what I'm trying to say is that I don't think she had the same quality of reflection that a person would have if they had undisturbed space in their central psychology. Okay, so I'm not trying to say she had no reflection and didn't know what she was doing. It's not psychosis. But I'm just saying the quality of her deliberation wasn't the same as somebody who would have literally an undisturbed state. And I think any of us who've had any addiction issues, any of us who have ever had any behavior issues ever in our lives, we know that even though you're aware of what you're doing, you don't really have the full quality of deliberation that a person would have if they didn't have these other, speed issues or addictive issues or disturbance, basically. Okay, so let's just be fair. Koury Ritchins knew what she was doing, but she was operating with a chronic disturbance. Her oven was turned on high. Okay, and when your oven is on high, you just don't have the same quality as a person who has like peacefulness on the inside. It's just not the same psychology. Okay, even though you do have deliberation, it's not the same quality of deliberation. Okay, and so the same thing goes with James Craig. I keep forgetting his name, but yeah, but basically, he probably already like Koury was always tended to be very fast. Okay, I mean, you can't ignore that. He already had a certain temperament that wasn't really given to the best, let's say, space for reflection and deliberation. But you throw on top of that he's in this exciting, adulterous relationships, probably very attracted, probably in the honeymoon phase, no pun intended. And basically, he's able to imagine doing things very consciously, like ordering, like I think on Amazon or on whatever, he was ordering online, like, materials and even things like cyanide, to poison his wife with cyanide. And I mean, I'm sorry, like, let's just be honest. Okay. That right there shows that even though he knew what he was doing, he wasn't really deliberating in the most meaningful way. Okay, even though if he thought maybe he could get away with it, there are so many ways that could backfire on you. Okay, because like even though, yeah, I agree, it's not that easy for doctors to detect a cyanide poisoning. Okay, I admit that it may not be that easy, but also not that hard either. Okay, in other words, you may not detect that it's cyanide poisoning, like say in the first two emergency room visits. Because, when you first see somebody in the emergency room, you have to rule out so many things. It's hard to like put your finger and say, oh, I know this is cyanide poisoning. Okay. You have to go through so much of a sequence of ruling out things and not knowing exactly. And there could be so many other reasons. Okay. Especially now we're in this age of like post-COVID, where people have long COVID and they have all kinds of complications. I mean, bottom line is that, doctors, they can't guess. There's like 1,000 reasons why a person could come in the hospital and be having the symptoms. So I understand that he was right in a way that maybe it's not that easy to put your finger on a cyanide poisoning when it comes to the emergency room. Okay, but he didn't understand, and he didn't really. And he's a dentist. I mean, he should know better. He works in health. He works in healthcare, but he didn't understand that even though they might not catch it right away, okay, it's likely that when someone dies for an unexplained reason when they're only like in their 40s, okay, it's likely that that's going to get investigated. And at some point through autopsy toxicology, eventually people are going to figure out that it could be cyanide. And then he's there online making traceable transactions, buying potassium cyanide. I mean, yeah, whatever. I think was it potassium cyanide, but anyway, he was buying cyanide. Okay. So basically, like, if he had just thought a little more about it, he was actually doing something really stupid. Okay. I mean, really doing something stupid. And the same with Koury Ritchins. The fact that she was actually using text messaging, to order fentanyl. I mean, it's very clear to me that these people did not have their full judgment. Okay. So yes, they're guilty. The law holds them to the same standard as all of us. But I think we have to understand that, through the combination of being very speedy and having that kind of destroyer complex, all in the wrong combination, you know, it's sort of like the perfect storm. And yeah, they're guilty, and I think the law should hold them responsible. But I think we also need to understand and learn that our capacity can be diminished by these kind of disturbances. So thanks for watching.